Picture this. You are a maester in the grand library of the Citadel, surrounded by ancient tomes and crumbling scrolls that chronicle the rise and fall of dynasties. The candlelight flickers across yellowed pages as you trace your finger along bloodline charts that spiral inward like a closing fist. Here, in these dusty volumes, lies the story of House Targaryen, a family that believed their blood was liquid fire, too pure to be diluted by common streams. You pause at a particularly disturbing entry, one that makes your scholarly composure crack just slightly. The words describe unions that would make even the most jaded historian recoil. Fathers and daughters, brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, all justified by the belief that dragon blood must remain untainted. These weren't isolated incidents of royal excess. They were the calculated foundation of an empire built on the systematic destruction of genetic diversity. As you delve deeper into these forbidden chronicles, you begin to understand a horrifying truth. The Targaryens didn't just practice incest, they weaponized it, turning their own bloodline into both their greatest strength and their ultimate curse. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of royal decadence, but a masterclass in how absolute power can corrupt not just politically, but genetically, creating monsters in the most literal sense. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of fictional history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Targaryen obsession with bloodline purity didn't begin with madness. It began with dragons. When Aegon the Conqueror first set foot on Westerosi soil 3 centuries before the events we know so well, he brought with him more than just 3 dragons and 2 sister wives. He carried a belief system that would poison his family tree for generations to come. Picture the scene. Aegon standing on the shores of what would become King's Landing, flanked by Visenya and Rhaenys. Both his sisters, both his wives, both carrying his children. To the lords of Westeros, this arrangement seemed like the height of foreign perversion. But to the Targaryens, it was the only way to preserve what they believed made them special: the ability to bond with dragons. The Valyrian freehold, their ancestral home, had been built on this principle for thousands of years. The dragon lords of Old Valyria practiced brother-sister marriages not out of lust or political convenience, but out of a genuine belief that their magical abilities were tied to the purity of their bloodline. When the doom consumed Valyria in fire and ash, only the Targaryens survived, and they were determined never to let their dragon blood become diluted by lesser lineages. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. The Targaryens weren't content to simply continue their ancestral practices. They elevated incest to an art form, creating increasingly complex justifications for unions that grew more genetically dangerous with each generation. What started as brother-sister marriages evolved into father-daughter unions, uncle-niece pairings, and eventually relationships so close that the family tree began to resemble a ladder rather than a branching network. Aegon I established the template that would doom his descendants. His marriage to both his sisters wasn't just accepted, it was celebrated as proof of Targaryen superiority. The maesters of the time, those scholars who should have understood the dangers of such close breeding, instead created elaborate genealogical justifications for what they termed the blood of the dragon. They wrote treatises explaining how Targaryen blood was fundamentally different from that of common men, how it required special preservation to maintain its magical properties. These early justifications would echo through centuries of increasingly horrific unions. Every Targaryen king who married his sister pointed back to Aegon's example. Every father who wed his daughter claimed he was following ancient Valyrian custom. The precedent set by the Conqueror became an unbreakable chain that bound his descendants to a cycle of genetic deterioration disguised as noble tradition. The true horror of the Targaryen bloodline becomes clear when you examine their systematic approach to marriage arrangements. This wasn't random royal excess. It was a carefully orchestrated program designed to concentrate dragon blood at any cost. The Targaryens maintained detailed records of their bloodlines, tracking which unions produce the strongest dragon riders and which seem to dilute their magical abilities. King Jaehaerys Hynes, known as the Conciliator, provides a perfect example of how the family's genetic obsessions superseded even basic human decency. Despite being remembered as one of the greatest Targaryen kings, Jaehaerys orchestrated some of the most disturbing marriage arrangements in the family's history. He married his own sister, Alysanne, naturally, but his treatment of his children reveals the true depths of Targaryen genetic fanaticism. When his eldest son, Aemon, died tragically, Jaehaerys faced a succession crisis. Rather than naming his second son Baelon as heir, he spent months calculating which of his children had produced the purest dragon blood in their offspring. He examined his grandchildren like livestock, measuring their silver hair, their violet eyes, their affinity for dragons. The king's decision-making process resembled that of a horse breeder more than a father choosing his successor. Most disturbingly, Jaehaerys began arranging marriages for his grandchildren while they were still infants, pairing them based not on political advantage or personal compatibility, but solely on genetic calculations designed to concentrate Targaryen traits. Princess Rhaenyra was betrothed to her uncle Daemon before she could walk, while Prince Aegon was promised to his sister Helaena in a union that would produce some of the most genetically damaged children in Targaryen history. The Dance of Dragons, that brutal civil war that nearly destroyed House Targaryen, had its origins in these genetic obsessions. The conflict wasn't just about succession, it was about which branch of the family carried the purest dragon blood. Both sides of the war claimed legitimacy based not on legal precedent or political support, but on their superior Targaryen genetics. Rhaenyra's supporters argued that her children by Laenor Velaryon, despite their obviously non-Targaryen features, carried true dragon blood through their mother's line. Aegon the Conqueror's faction countered that his children by his sister wife Helaena represented the purest possible combination of Targaryen genetics. The realm burned not for political principles, but for competing theories of genetic superiority. The war's most horrific moments often centered around these bloodline obsessions. When Rhaenyra fed Aegon Stu's son to her dragon, she wasn't just eliminating a political rival, she was symbolically rejecting his genetic claims. When Aegon II had Rhaenyra devoured by his dragon in front of her own son, he was making a statement about which bloodline deserved to survive. The aftermath of the dance revealed the true cost of the Targaryen genetic experiment. The family emerged from the Civil War with their dragon population devastated and their bloodline so concentrated that genetic problems became impossible to ignore. Children were born with severe deformities, mental instabilities, and shortened lifespans. The very traits the Targaryens had tried to preserve through incest were being destroyed by their own breeding practices. Yet rather than recognizing these warning signs, the surviving Targaryens doubled down on their genetic fanaticism. King Aegon III, despite witnessing the horrors of the dance firsthand, continued the family's incestuous traditions. His successors became even more extreme in their bloodline obsessions, creating marriages so genetically dangerous that they produced children who could barely function as human beings. The reign of Baelor the Blessed represents perhaps the most tragic example of Targaryen genetic deterioration. This king, born of multiple generations of brother-sister marriages, exhibited the kind of religious mania and disconnect from reality that would become increasingly common in later Targaryens. Baelor's madness wasn't just personal tragedy. It was a preview of the genetic catastrophe that awaited the dynasty. Baelor's treatment of his own sisters reveals how completely the Targaryens had lost touch with normal human relationships. He locked his sisters away not to protect them from others, but to protect himself from the temptation of following family tradition. The king's journals, preserved in the Red Keep's archives, describe his sisters in terms that blur the line between familial affection and sexual desire. Even his attempts at religious purity were contaminated by the genetic poison that ran through his veins. The maesters of Baelor's time began to document what they carefully termed the peculiarities of dragon blood. Their coded language described children born with extra fingers, shortened limbs, and severe mental disabilities. They wrote of Targaryen infants who couldn't survive outside the womb, of children who aged rapidly and died before their 10th birthday, of adults whose minds never developed beyond childhood. But these medical observations were always couched in language that preserved the fiction of Targaryen superiority. The Maesters described genetic defects as signs of the dragon's touch or marks of ancient Valyrian magic. They created elaborate theories about how physical deformities actually indicated stronger connections to dragonfire. This intellectual dishonesty allowed the Targaryens to continue their destructive breeding practices while maintaining the illusion that they were preserving something noble and magical. The systematic nature of Targaryen incest becomes even more disturbing when you examine their approach to those family members who questioned the practice. Any Targaryen who suggested marrying outside the family, who showed romantic interest in non-relatives, or who criticized the genetic consequences of their breeding program was quickly marginalized or eliminated. Prince Duncan, son of King Aegon V, provides a perfect example. When Duncan chose to marry for love rather than genetic calculation, his family's reaction was swift and brutal. They stripped him of his inheritance, exiled him from court, and systematically erased him from official family histories. The message was clear. Targaryens who refused to participate in the genetic program would be treated as traitors to their own blood. This pattern repeated throughout Targaryen history. Princess Rhaenyra's rebellious behavior was punished not just because she defied royal protocol, but because she threatened to dilute dragon blood by choosing her own partners. Prince Daemon's various marriages and relationships were constantly scrutinized through the lens of genetic purity rather than political advantage. Even Targaryen bastards faced different treatment depending on whether their mothers came from bloodlines deemed worthy of mixing with dragon blood. The Targaryens developed an entire mythology around their genetic practices that went far beyond simple justification. They created religious ceremonies specifically for incestuous marriages, complete with prayers to Valyrian gods and rituals designed to bless the union of close relatives. These ceremonies weren't just political theater. They were genuine expressions of the family's belief that their incest was divinely mandated. The family maintained detailed genealogical records that read more like breeding charts than family trees. They tracked not just marriages and births, but the specific traits exhibited by each child: hair color, eye color, dragon bonding ability, and what they termed strength of blood. Children who showed strong Targaryen characteristics were favored for important marriages, while those with weaker traits were often married to distant cousins in attempts to strengthen their genetic profile. This systematic approach to bloodline management created a family dynamic unlike anything else in Westerosi history. Targaryen children grew up knowing their value was measured not by their individual qualities, but by their potential contribution to the family's genetic goals. Brothers and sisters were evaluated as potential spouses from early childhood. Parents viewed their children primarily as vessels for preserving dragon blood, rather than as individuals deserving of love and protection. The psychological impact of this system on individual Targaryens was devastating, and would only grow worse as the genetic damage accumulated over generations. But that is a story for another time, as we have only begun to scratch the surface of this family's descent into genetic madness disguised as noble tradition. The psychological warfare that the Targaryens waged against their own children becomes even more horrifying when you understand how they systematically groomed successive generations to accept and even crave incestuous relationships. This wasn't accidental conditioning, it was a deliberate program designed to ensure that Targaryen children would never question the genetic prison their family had constructed around them. Consider the childhood of Princess Daenerys, daughter of King Aegon IV. From the moment she could understand language, she was told stories about the great love between Aegon the Conqueror and his sister wives. Her nursemaids sang lullabies about dragon blood, calling to dragon blood. Her tutors taught her that the most beautiful love stories in history were between Targaryen siblings. By the time she reached adolescence, the idea of marrying anyone other than her brother seemed not just wrong, but almost incomprehensible. The family created an entire educational system designed to normalize incest. Targaryen children learned their letters from books that glorified brother-sister marriages. Their history lessons focused obsessively on the magical achievements of the most inbred Targaryen kings and queens. They were taught that their violet eyes and silver hair were gifts from the gods that must be preserved through careful breeding, and that anyone who didn't share these traits was fundamentally inferior. Most insidiously, the Targaryens used religion as a tool of genetic manipulation. They claimed that the seven-faced god himself had blessed their incestuous unions, pointing to the faith's acceptance of their marriages as divine approval. When that wasn't enough, they created their own religious interpretations that made incest not just acceptable, but spiritually necessary. Children were taught that refusing to marry within the family was a sin against their ancestors and a betrayal of their divine nature. The family's approach to sexuality was equally calculated and disturbing. Targaryen children were encouraged to develop romantic feelings for their siblings from an early age. Brothers and sisters were housed together, bathed together, and educated together in ways that deliberately blurred the boundaries between familial affection and sexual attraction. By the time they reached marriageable age, the transition from sibling to spouse felt natural rather than aberrant. The most chilling aspect of this psychological conditioning was how it created genuine love between family members who were simultaneously victims and perpetrators of genetic abuse. These weren't just political marriages between reluctant partners. Many Targaryen siblings genuinely adored each other in ways that combined familial devotion with sexual passion. The family had successfully weaponized human emotion itself, turning love into a tool for genetic destruction. King Viserys Y and Queen Alicent Hightower's children provide a perfect case study in how this conditioning worked in practice. Despite Alicent being an outsider who initially resisted Targaryen marriage customs, her children were gradually molded into the family's genetic program. Prince Aegon II was taught from infancy that his sister Helaena was his destined bride. Princess Helaena was raised believing that her brother's love was the purest form of affection she could ever experience. The conditioning was so thorough that when these siblings finally married, they weren't just fulfilling family expectations. They were consummating relationships they had been trained to desire since childhood. Their wedding night wasn't the mechanical joining of political assets, but the culmination of years of psychological manipulation designed to make incest feel like destiny. The Targaryens also developed sophisticated methods for dealing with family members who showed resistance to their genetic program. Children who seemed reluctant to accept incestuous marriages were subjected to intensive re-education programs that combined religious instruction, historical indoctrination, and emotional manipulation. They were isolated from outside influences and surrounded by family members who reinforced the message that dragon blood must remain pure. More troubling still was how the family dealt with those who couldn't be convinced. Princess Sarah's rebellion against family marriage expectations resulted in her effective exile from the family. Her father, King Jaehaerys, didn't just punish her political defiance. He systematically destroyed her sense of identity as a Targaryen. She was told that her refusal to marry within the family had stripped her of her dragon blood, that she was no longer truly his daughter. This psychological cruelty was repeated throughout Targaryen history. Family members who questioned the genetic program weren't just politically marginalized, they were made to feel like they had lost their essential identity. The family created a system where being a true Targaryen was inseparable from participating in incest. To reject one was to reject the other, leaving rebellious family members with an impossible choice between genetic participation and complete alienation from their heritage. The Targaryens' success in normalizing incest extended beyond their immediate family to the broader noble houses of Westeros. Through centuries of political pressure and cultural influence, they gradually shifted the kingdom's attitudes toward their marriage practices. What had initially been seen as foreign perversion slowly became accepted as the natural order of things. This cultural manipulation was achieved through a combination of fear and fascination. The Targaryens made it clear that criticizing their marriage practices was tantamount to questioning their right to rule. Noble houses that expressed disapproval found themselves excluded from court, stripped of lands, or worse. At the same time, the family cultivated an aura of mystique around their genetic practices, suggesting that their incestuous unions were the source of their magical abilities. The Maesters played a crucial role in this cultural shift, producing scholarly works that legitimized Targaryen breeding practices through pseudoscientific theories about bloodline purity. These academic justifications gave noble houses the intellectual cover they needed to accept what their instincts told them was wrong. If the learned men of the Citadel declared that Targaryen incest was genetically beneficial, who were simple lords to argue? The Faith of the Seven's eventual acceptance of Targaryen marriage practices represents perhaps the most successful example of the family's cultural manipulation. Through a combination of political pressure, generous donations, and careful theological arguments, the Targaryens convinced the religious establishment that their marriages were blessed by divine will. High septons, who had once condemned incest as an abomination, began performing wedding ceremonies for Targaryen siblings with elaborate pomp and circumstance. This religious endorsement was crucial because it provided moral legitimacy for practices that violated basic human taboos. When the highest religious authorities in the realm declared that Targaryen incest was not just acceptable but holy, it became much easier for the broader population to rationalize their acceptance of genetic practices they instinctively found disturbing. The Targaryens also used their dragons as tools of genetic enforcement, making it clear that questioning their breeding practices could have deadly consequences. When the faith militant rose up against King Aerys, partly because of his incestuous marriage, the Targaryens responded with dragon fire. The message was unmistakable: challenge our genetic practices and face incineration. This use of dragons to enforce genetic compliance created a feedback loop that made resistance increasingly difficult. As the Targaryens became more isolated through inbreeding, they became more dependent on fear to maintain their position. As they became more dependent on fear, they became more willing to use extreme violence against anyone who questioned their practices. The dragons that were supposedly the product of pure bloodlines became the weapons used to protect the incest that was supposedly necessary to maintain them. The economic dimensions of Targaryen genetic practices reveal another layer of calculation in their systematic approach to incest. The family understood that their marriage customs weren't just about preserving magical abilities. They were also about concentrating wealth and power within an increasingly small genetic pool. Every incestuous marriage kept Targaryen resources from being diluted through alliances with other houses. This economic motivation became more important as the family's power waned following the Dance of Dragons. With fewer dragons and diminished political influence, the Targaryens couldn't afford to share their remaining wealth with outside families through traditional marriage alliances. Incest became not just a genetic strategy, but a survival mechanism for maintaining what little power they had left. The family developed elaborate financial instruments designed to support their genetic program. They created trust funds that could only be accessed by family members who married within acceptable bloodlines. They established inheritance laws that favored children born of incestuous unions over those with mixed parentage. They even created economic incentives for extended family members to participate in the breeding program, offering land grants and titles to cousins who agreed to marry other cousins. These economic manipulations had devastating effects on individual family members who found themselves trapped between financial security and genetic participation. Targaryen women who might have preferred to marry outside the family faced the prospect of poverty if they refused arranged incestuous marriages. Younger sons who could have made advantageous political marriages were pressured to wed their nieces or cousins to maintain access to family wealth. The systematic nature of these economic pressures reveals how completely the Targaryens had subordinated individual human happiness to their genetic obsessions. Family members weren't just expected to participate in incest. They were financially coerced into doing so through mechanisms that made resistance economically ruinous. Perhaps most tragically, the Targaryens created an entire mythology around the supposed benefits of their genetic practices that became increasingly divorced from reality as the physical evidence of genetic damage mounted. They claimed that their frequent stillbirths and infant deaths were signs that only the strongest dragon blood could survive. They interpreted obvious genetic deformities as marks of special favor from their ancestors. They convinced themselves that the increasing mental instability in their bloodline was actually enhanced magical sensitivity. This self-deception became so complete that the family genuinely believed they were creating genetic superiority, even as they produced generation after generation of damaged children. The contradiction between their mythology and their reality created a psychological pressure that would eventually contribute to the madness that consumed their final generations. But the true horror of the Targaryen genetic experiment was yet to come, as the accumulated damage of centuries of inbreeding began to manifest in ways that would make their earlier genetic problems seem mild by comparison. The reign of Aegon IV, known to history as Aegon the Unworthy, represents the moment when Targaryen genetic obsessions crossed the line from systematic abuse into outright genetic terrorism. This wasn't just a king who practiced incest. This was a man who weaponized his bloodline against his own family members in ways that would have horrified even his ancestors. Aegon IV understood that the family's centuries of inbreeding had created a genetic powder keg, and rather than trying to defuse it, he deliberately lit the fuse. His approach to bloodline management combined the worst aspects of Targaryen genetic fanaticism with a level of personal cruelty that transformed the royal family into his private laboratory for genetic experimentation. The king's treatment of his sister wife, Queen Aerys, reveals how completely the Targaryens had lost any sense of basic human decency in their pursuit of genetic purity. Aerys was a frail, sickly woman whose body had been damaged by the genetic consequences of generations of inbreeding. She suffered from chronic illnesses, frequent miscarriages, and what court physicians delicately termed difficulties with intimate relations. Any reasonable husband would have shown compassion for her suffering. Instead, Aegon IV saw his wife's genetic damage as a challenge to overcome through increasingly extreme measures. He forced her to endure pregnancy after pregnancy, each one more dangerous than the last. When she miscarried, he blamed her for being too weak to carry proper dragon blood. When she gave birth to sickly children, he accused her of contaminating his seed with her inferior genetics. The queen became a victim of both her family's genetic heritage and her husband's determination to extract maximum reproductive value from her damaged body. But Aegon IV's genetic experiments weren't limited to his legitimate wife. The king embarked on what can only be described as a systematic breeding program designed to test the limits of Targaryen genetic compatibility. He took mistresses from across the known world, carefully selecting women based on their physical characteristics and bloodlines. His goal wasn't simple adultery, it was comparative genetic analysis conducted through human experimentation. The king maintained detailed records of his various liaisons, noting which combinations produced children with strong Targaryen traits and which seemed to dilute the bloodline. He tracked hair color, eye color, and what he called fire affinity in his numerous bastards. Children who showed promise were brought to court and studied like laboratory specimens. Those who disappointed him were dismissed or worse. Most disturbing of all, Aegon IV began arranging marriages between his legitimate children and his most promising bastards, creating genetic combinations that pushed the boundaries of even Targaryen tolerance for incest. He planned to marry his daughter Daenerys to several of her half-brothers simultaneously, reasoning that multiple fathers would increase the chances of producing genetically superior offspring. Only Queen Aerys' desperate intervention prevented these plans from being implemented. The king's genetic obsessions reached their horrifying climax with his treatment of his son and heir, Prince Daeron. Aegon IV became convinced that Daeron had been contaminated by his mother's weak bloodline and was therefore unfit to carry forward the Targaryen genetic legacy. Rather than simply disinheriting him, the king launched a systematic campaign to prove that Daeron wasn't his biological son. This campaign involved some of the most degrading and invasive procedures ever inflicted on a member of the royal family. Aegon IV had court physicians examine Daeron's body for signs of non-Targaryen heritage, measuring everything from the texture of his hair to the exact shade of his eyes. He commissioned artists to create detailed anatomical drawings comparing Daeron's features to those of previous Targaryen kings. Most humiliatingly, he forced his son to undergo what amounted to genetic testing through magical means, summoning sorcerers and red priests to divine the truth of his parentage. The psychological impact on Prince Daeron was devastating. Here was a young man who had been raised to believe that his Targaryen blood made him special, only to have his own father publicly question that heritage through the most humiliating methods imaginable. Darren began to exhibit signs of severe anxiety and depression, constantly checking mirrors for signs that his appearance was becoming less Targaryen. He developed obsessive behaviors around his clothing and grooming, desperately trying to emphasize whatever dragon blood traits he possessed. The prince's suffering became a source of entertainment for Aegon the Conqueror, who would invite courtiers to observe his son's desperate attempts to prove his genetic legitimacy. The king turned his heir's psychological breakdown into a public spectacle, using Darren's pain as evidence that weak bloodlines produced weak minds. The cruelty was calculated to reinforce the mythology of Targaryen genetic superiority, while simultaneously destroying the young man who was supposed to inherit the throne. Aegon IV's reign also marked the first time that Targaryen genetic practices were systematically documented by outside observers. Visiting maesters from other kingdoms began keeping secret records of what they witnessed at the royal court, creating a body of evidence that reveals the true extent of the family's genetic deterioration. These accounts, hidden away in various libraries across the Seven Kingdoms, paint a picture of a royal house that had completely lost touch with reality. The visiting scholars described children born with severe physical deformities that were celebrated as signs of dragon blessing. They witnessed Targaryen infants who couldn't survive more than a few days outside the womb being preserved and displayed as proof of the family's magical nature. They documented adults whose minds had never developed beyond childhood, being treated as oracles whose nonsensical utterances were interpreted as prophetic wisdom. Most disturbing of all, these outside observers recorded the systematic abuse of Targaryen women, who were treated as nothing more than breeding stock for the family's genetic experiments. They described princess being forced into marriages with close relatives while they were still children, being subjected to medical examinations to determine their fertility, and being discarded when they failed to produce the genetically perfect offspring their husbands demanded. The Maester's secret reports reveal that by Aegon IV's time, the Targaryens had created what amounted to a genetic cult centered around the worship of their own bloodline. Family members who showed signs of genetic damage were hidden away in secret chambers beneath the Red Keep, their existence denied but their care maintained to preserve the fiction of Targaryen perfection. These hidden relatives lived like ghosts within their own family, fed and clothed but never acknowledged, their suffering concealed to protect the mythology of dragon blood superiority. The economic cost of maintaining these genetic experiments was staggering. Aegon IV spent enormous sums on physicians, alchemists, and supposed experts in bloodline purification. He funded expeditions to the ruins of Valyria searching for ancient texts on dragon breeding. He established what amounted to research institutions dedicated to studying Targaryen genetics, complete with libraries, laboratories, and specimens both living and dead. The king's court became a magnet for charlatans and genuine scholars alike, all claiming to possess secrets that could enhance or purify dragon blood. Some offered potions that promised to strengthen Targaryen traits in children. Others claimed to have discovered ancient Valyrian techniques for ensuring genetic compatibility between close relatives. A few even suggested surgical procedures that could physically alter Targaryen children to make them more closely resemble their ancestors. Aegon IV pursued all of these options with the desperation of a man who understood that his family's genetic foundation was crumbling, but refused to abandon the practices that had caused the damage. He spent his kingdom's wealth chasing impossible solutions to problems that were fundamentally unfixable through the methods he was willing to consider. The idea of simply marrying outside the family was so antithetical to Targaryen identity that it literally never occurred to him as a possibility. The international implications of Aegon IV's genetic experiments began to affect Westeros's relationships with other kingdoms. Foreign diplomats reported back to their rulers about the disturbing practices they witnessed at the Targaryen court, creating a reputation for the royal family that went far beyond their previous image as eccentric dragon lords. The Targaryens were increasingly seen as dangerous madmen whose genetic obsessions threatened the stability of the entire continent. Marriage negotiations with other royal houses became almost impossible as word spread about the Targaryen approach to bloodline management. No foreign prince wanted to marry a Targaryen princess who might have been subjected to genetic experimentation. No foreign princess wanted to marry into a family that might expect her to participate in incestuous practices or subject her children to invasive genetic testing. The isolation that resulted from this international disgust only reinforced the Targaryens' dependence on incest as their primary marriage strategy. As outside options disappeared, the family was forced to rely even more heavily on marriages between close relatives, accelerating the genetic damage that was already consuming their bloodline. The cycle of isolation and inbreeding became self-reinforcing, trapping the family in an ever-tightening spiral of genetic destruction. Perhaps most tragically, Aegon IV's reign established precedents that his successors would follow with even more devastating results. The king's systematic approach to genetic experimentation, his treatment of family members as laboratory subjects, and his willingness to sacrifice individual human dignity for the supposed good of the bloodline, became the template for how future Targaryen rulers would manage their genetic inheritance. The psychological conditioning that had begun in earlier generations reached new depths of sophistication under Aegon IV. The king developed elaborate rituals designed to reinforce the family's genetic mythology, while simultaneously identifying and eliminating any traces of genetic diversity that might have crept into the bloodline. Children were subjected to regular examinations to ensure they maintained proper Targaryen characteristics. Those who showed signs of deviation were subjected to corrective measures that ranged from dietary restrictions to more invasive interventions. The king also established what amounted to a genetic police force within the royal household, composed of servants and minor nobles whose job was to monitor family members for signs of genetic impurity or unauthorized breeding. These genetic enforcers had the authority to investigate suspicious relationships, prevent unauthorized marriages, and report any family member who seemed to be developing romantic attachments outside the approved bloodline. The systematic nature of this genetic surveillance created an atmosphere of paranoia within the royal family that would persist for generations. Targaryen children learned to hide their true feelings and desires, understanding that any deviation from approved genetic behavior could result in punishment or exile. The family became a collection of genetic prisoners, each member constantly monitored and controlled to ensure their compliance with breeding programs they had no choice but to accept. Aegon IV's death in 184 AC didn't end his genetic legacy, it multiplied it exponentially. On his deathbed, the king legitimized all of his bastard children, creating dozens of potential claimants to the throne who carried various combinations of Targaryen genetics mixed with outside bloodlines. This act, intended as a final assertion of his genetic virility, instead created the conditions for a civil war that would make the Dance of Dragons look like a minor family dispute. The Blackfire rebellions that followed weren't just political conflicts. They were genetic wars fought between different interpretations of what constituted pure dragon blood. Each faction claimed legitimacy based on their superior Targaryen genetics, while simultaneously arguing that their opponents had been contaminated by inferior bloodlines. The realm bled for generations over questions of genetic purity that had no objective answers. The wars also revealed how completely the Targaryen genetic mythology had infected the broader consciousness of Westeros. Common soldiers died fighting for kings they believed possessed superior dragon blood, while noble houses chose sides based on competing theories of genetic legitimacy. The entire continent had become complicit in the Targaryen genetic experiment, treating bloodline purity as a legitimate basis for political authority. But even the devastating Blackfire rebellions were merely a preview of the genetic catastrophe that awaited the Targaryen dynasty. The worst was yet to come, as centuries of accumulated genetic damage began to manifest in ways that would make Aegon's reign seem almost rational by comparison. The true horror of the Targaryen bloodline was still gathering strength, preparing to unleash itself upon a family that had spent generations engineering its own destruction. The final chapter of the Targaryen genetic experiment would be written in madness and flame, as centuries of accumulated damage finally consumed the dynasty that had spent so long engineering its own destruction. By the time of the Mad King Aerys II, the family tree had become so twisted that it resembled less a genealogical chart than a medical case study in the catastrophic effects of sustained inbreeding. Aerys too represented the logical endpoint of Targaryen genetic philosophy. A king whose madness wasn't an aberration, but the inevitable result of a bloodline that had been systematically poisoned for over 3 centuries. His paranoia, his violent mood swings, his obsession with fire and blood, these weren't character flaws but genetic symptoms of a family that had finally succeeded in creating the monster they had always been working toward. The king's relationship with his sister wife Rhaella reveals how completely the Targaryens had lost any semblance of normal human emotion. This wasn't the romantic love between siblings that earlier generations had claimed to experience. This was a toxic combination of sexual obsession, genetic fanaticism, and violent possession that destroyed both participants. Aerys raped his wife repeatedly, convinced that their violent couplings would produce the perfect dragon heir. When she miscarried, he blamed her for being too weak to carry his superior seed. When she gave birth to stillborn children, he accused her of deliberately sabotaging his genetic legacy. The king's treatment of his surviving children showed how the family's genetic obsessions had evolved into systematic child abuse, disguised as dynastic planning. Prince Rhaegar was subjected to constant genetic testing and evaluation, with court physicians measuring everything from his reflexes to his dreams for signs of dragon blood strength. Princess Daenerys was promised in marriage to her brother before she could walk, with elaborate ceremonies celebrating the future union of their pure bloodlines. Most disturbing of all, Aerys began planning genetic experiments that would have made even Aegon the Conqueror recoil in horror. The Mad King became convinced that the only way to restore true dragon power was through increasingly extreme forms of incest. He planned to marry his daughter to both of her brothers simultaneously, reasoning that multiple fathers would increase the chances of producing a child with the concentrated dragon blood necessary to hatch new eggs. The king also developed theories about genetic purification through fire that led to some of the most horrific practices in Targaryen history. He began subjecting family members to what he called fire tests, exposing them to flames to determine the strength of their dragon blood. Those who burned were declared genetically impure and eliminated. Those who survived were celebrated as carrying the truest bloodline, regardless of the permanent damage inflicted on their bodies. Aerys II's reign marked the first time that Targaryen genetic practices began to threaten the stability of the entire realm. The king's madness wasn't contained within the royal family. It began affecting his ability to govern, leading to increasingly erratic decisions that pushed the kingdom toward civil war. His paranoid delusions about genetic contamination extended to his political relationships, as he became convinced that lords who opposed him were somehow polluting his bloodline through magical means. The rebellion that ultimately destroyed the Targaryen dynasty wasn't just a political uprising. It was the realm's final rejection of a genetic experiment that had grown too dangerous to tolerate. Robert Baratheon's war wasn't simply about removing a mad king from power. It was about ending a bloodline that had become a threat to human civilization itself. The systematic nature of Targaryen genetic damage becomes most apparent when examining the fate of the dynasty's final generation. Princess Daenerys, born after her father's death, carried within her DNA the accumulated genetic poison of centuries of inbreeding. Her ability to survive fire and bond with dragons wasn't evidence of magical superiority. It was proof of how completely her family had transformed themselves into something no longer entirely human. The princess's eventual descent into madness followed the same pattern that had consumed her ancestors, but with consequences that extended far beyond the royal family. Her burning of King's Landing represented the ultimate expression of Targaryen genetic philosophy. The belief that dragon blood gave its carriers the right to determine who lived and who died based on their own twisted understanding of genetic purity. Even in exile, even with dragons returned to the world, even with apparent proof that their bloodline carried genuine magical power, the Targaryens couldn't escape the genetic trap they had spent centuries constructing. Daenerys' inability to form normal human relationships, her tendency toward violent solutions, her conviction that her bloodline made her fundamentally superior to other people, all of these traits reflected the psychological damage that centuries of genetic manipulation had embedded in her very DNA. The Targaryen approach to bloodline management also reveals the danger of allowing genetic theories to override basic human morality. The family's belief in their own superiority became a justification for treating other human beings as inferior creatures whose suffering was irrelevant compared to the supposed benefits of maintaining pure dragon blood. This genetic supremacism created a worldview where mass murder could be rationalized as genetic housekeeping, where the deaths of thousands could be justified as necessary sacrifices to preserve a superior bloodline. The maesters who documented the Targaryen dynasty's final collapse noted how the family's genetic mythology had become completely divorced from reality. Even as their bloodline produced increasingly damaged individuals, even as their mental instability became impossible to deny, the Targaryens continued to believe that they were creating genetic perfection through their breeding practices. This self-deception was so complete that they interpreted their own destruction as evidence of the world's unworthiness, rather than as the natural consequence of their genetic crimes. The international response to the Targaryen genetic experiment provides a sobering lesson in how quickly civilized societies can become complicit in systematic abuse when it's disguised as tradition or justified by claims of superiority. For centuries, the noble houses of Westeros participated in and enabled practices that they knew were fundamentally wrong, allowing their fear of dragons and their desire for political advantage to override their basic moral instincts. The faith of the Seven's eventual acceptance of Targaryen marriage practices represents perhaps the most tragic example of institutional corruption in Westerosi history. Religious leaders who should have been protecting the vulnerable instead provided moral cover for genetic abuse, creating theological justifications for practices that violated every principle their faith supposedly represented. The High Septons, who blessed incestuous marriages and proclaimed them holy, became active participants in a genetic experiment that consumed countless lives. The economic systems that supported Targaryen breeding practices reveal how financial incentives can be used to maintain abusive institutions long after their moral bankruptcy becomes obvious. The noble houses that profited from Targaryen rule, the merchants who sold them exotic goods and services, the craftsmen who created specialized equipment for their genetic experiments, all of these people became stakeholders in a system that treated human beings as breeding stock. Perhaps most tragically, the Targaryen genetic experiment succeeded in its own twisted way. The family did create individuals with genuinely supernatural abilities, did produce dragons, did achieve the magical power they had spent centuries pursuing, but this success came at a cost that no reasonable person would consider acceptable. The systematic destruction of human dignity, the normalization of abuse, and the creation of individuals so psychologically damaged that they became threats to civilization itself. The story of House Targaryen serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of genetic supremacism and the human cost of treating bloodlines as more important than individual lives. Their rise and fall demonstrates how the pursuit of genetic purity can become a form of collective madness that consumes not just those who practice it, but entire civilizations that allow it to continue unchallenged. In the end, the Targaryen bloodline achieved a kind of immortality, not through the dragons they created or the kingdoms they conquered, but through the lesson their destruction teaches about the price of genetic fanaticism. Their name lives on as a reminder that no bloodline, no matter how ancient or magical, is worth the systematic abuse of human beings. The dragons are gone, the throne is destroyed, but the memory of their genetic crimes remains as a warning to future generations about the dangers of believing that blood alone determines worth. The candlelight flickers one final time across these ancient pages as you close the tome, understanding now why some knowledge was meant to remain hidden in the deepest vaults of the Citadel. The Targaryen legacy isn't one of fire and blood, but of the terrible price paid when power corrupts not just politically but genetically, creating monsters in the most literal sense. Their story ends not with the roar of dragons, but with the whispered warning that some traditions are too dangerous to preserve, and some bloodlines too poisoned to continue.